What is up? And today I will be bringing you guys my biggest prospect in each UFC division. And I only have two rules for my criteria. And that is, for one, you cannot be ranked. And for two, you cannot have more than 5 fights in the UFC. Without further ado, let's get into the flyweight division. Starting off at men's flyweight, my biggest prospect is Joshua the Fearless Vaughn. And Joshua Vaughn, he is so good. I don't think I've ever seen crisper boxing out of an unranked fighter. I mean, he's 3-0 in the UFC, and he's fighting decent levels of competition. He was booked to fight, I have no idea how to pronounce his name, but he's the number 12 ranked fighter in the UFC flyweight division. Now, his fight got moved to next weekend in next UFC's card. He's going to be fighting Jose Johnson. You guys have to tune into that fight because that fight is going to be an absolute banger, and Joshua Van's going to put on an absolute showcase on that guy. After I saw Joshua Van fight Kevin Borjas, he set a significant strikes record to the body in a 3-round fight in the flyweight division, but it was still a super impressive record. And Joshua Van, he's 3-0 in the UFC, soon to be 4-0 in my opinion, and I think he one day could become a UFC champion. Moving on to the men's bantamweight division, we have, by absolutely no one's surprise, Peyton Talbot. This guy's the real deal, the real Sean O'Malley that people like to call him. I mean, he's so cool and calm and collected in the octagon. It's just like, it's just crazy to watch. I mean, he's a young, unranked fighter who has barely any fights in the UFC, and he's just fighting and he's acting like he's been there before. And I do believe that Peyton Talbot, after knocking out Giannis Gamori in the first 1-2 that he threw, I do believe that he's going to be highly ranked in the future. Could become a UFC champion, but that men's bantamweight division is super, super stacked, and we haven't really seen his grappling yet. So, you know, I am kind of concerned with how good he is on the ground because no one's really ever tried to take him down. And once we see that happen with someone like Merab, someone like Merab in the top of the division, you know, we'll just have to see what happens. But I do think that Peyton Talbot is extremely good, and I do think that he very much could become a UFC champion. Moving on to the men's featherweight division, my biggest prospect is Gene Silva. This guy has some absolute dynamite in his hands. He just knocked out Charles Jourdain, who is a very, very tough fighter. He is a tough out, and he has a granite chin, and knocking out someone like Charles Jourdain is super impressive. And he did it with ease, and he absolutely ran through Charles Jourdain, which I did not think was going to happen. And now he just stepped in on short notice to fight Drew Dober July 13th with his next UFC card in UFC Fight Night. Denver, definitely tune into that one because that fight is going to be great. I do think he runs through Drew Dober, but Drew Dober is going to be a very good test for him. He's also taken this fight on short notice, and, you know, he is coming off of a fight just last UFC pay-per-view he fought. So, you know, we'll have to see what happens, but I do think that Gene Silva is going to beat Drew Dober, and I do think that he's going to rank up very highly and very fast in the UFC featherweight division. Next up in the UFC lightweight division, my biggest prospect is Mike Davis. He barely makes the cut as he's 4-1 in the UFC, but his only loss was his UFC debut. Excuse me. His only loss was in his UFC debut against Gilbert Durinho Burns, and since then he's 4-0 in the UFC, and with 3 of those coming by finish. He had one of the worst beatdowns on Thomas Gifford. He just beat up Nate Levy, and he also beat the crap out of Vyacheslav Borshev, who is one of the most outstanding strikers in that division. But, you know, Chase Hooper did kind of beat him, but, you know, he's still great, man. He's still an absolutely great striker, and the fact that Mike Davis, who's a grappler, just absolutely took it to him like that on the feet is just crazy to me. And I think that Mike Davis is a future prospect. You guys better watch out for him because I think he has a big future in the UFC. Next up, moving on, we have the UFC welterweight division, and my biggest prospect is Miktek Oralbai. Miktek Oralbai is just the coolest guy. He kind of looks like he's from like an Ice Age or something, but he's super, super cool, and he's 2-0 in the UFC, And they're honestly against pretty decent levels of competition. He made his UFC debut against Euros Medic, who he's actually a pretty good fighter. And he made his UFC debut against him, and he subbed him, wrapped him up into a pretzel like it was nothing. And then he also just beat up Elvis Brenner, 30-27 him. Couldn't finish him, but Elvis Brenner is pretty decent levels of competition. I think that Miktek Worldwide is going to be very, very good in the UFC. We haven't really seen enough of him, and his striking does look pretty mediocre, but I think that grappling is going to really, really come in handy in this welterweight division, and I think that Miktek Worldwide is going to absolutely dominate the rankings. Moving on to the UFC middleweight division, we have, because obviously, we have Bo Nickel. Bo Nickel, what do I even really got to say about Bo Nickel? He's an absolute can crusher, and he's not proven at all, but he's like a really good collegiate wrestler, so I guess he's going to be great, but he's literally fighting worse competition. Every time he fights, it's a worse fighter. He made his UFC debut against Jamie Pickett, who sucks, right? And then he fought Val Woodburn, who sucks more. And then who did he just fight in his last fight? I can't even remember his name. It's such a nobody. Oh, Cody Brundage, who's even worse than both of them. Cody Brundage is a lazy, lazy quitter that Bo Nickel absolutely ran through. And I think he's going to run through all these cans. If they keep giving him cans, give Bo Nickel a ranked fighter. He's 3-0 in the UFC. He's undefeated. And, you know, he was 2-0 on the Contender Series. He is really, really good, but he has not fought anybody even close to being decent yet. All these guys that he's fighting would be terrible in Cage Warriors, right? Jamie Pickett, Cody Brundage, I don't even think they would do good in Cage Warriors or in like Risen or in like, I don't know, 1FC, something like that, dude. Like, Bo Nickel's got to fight real good UFC competition. And then maybe we could talk about him being good in the future, but he's still the biggest prospect at middleweight, but I am not as high on Bo Nickel as everybody else. UFC light heavyweight division, my biggest prospect is Vitor Petrino. And I know, didn't you just lose to Anthony Smith? One, Anthony Smith is top 10. So the fact that he even took that fight is super impressive to me. And two, he kind of just like put himself in a guillotine, right? He shot a takedown and then got guillotined in a minute. That's all that happened. Okay, I don't think that shows how good Vitor Petrino is at all. I don't think getting caught in a guillotine by a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt who's top 10 in the UFC in a minute does not show if you're a good prospect or not. All right? I honestly think that the Anthony Smith that we saw fought Roman Dolidze would get absolutely mauled by Vitor Petrino. Okay? I think Vitor Petrino would have and should have absolutely ran through Anthony Smith, but he fell into a guillotine, so I guess he's not a prospect anymore. Right? Moving on to the UFC heavyweight division, I have Waldo Cortez Acosta as my biggest prospect. And listen, I do not like Waldo Cortez Acosta at all. The way he was taunting Andrei Arlovsky and like mean mugging Andrei Arlovsky, like the nicest UFC fighter, a big legend of the sport, right? It was just insane to me. And, you know, I really don't like him. I'm not a fan of him. He has pillow hands, but he did kind of just run through Rebellis de Spain, and he can wrestle. Waldo Cortez Acosta, he can wrestle. And, you know, if you can wrestle in the heavyweight division, you're probably going to be great because there's not many grapplers in there. So, my biggest prospect, unfortunately, is Waldo Cortez Acosta.